Hello everyone, my name is Tony Byrne and welcome to today's webinar, The Right Way to Select Collaboration in Social Software. And special thanks to those of you who tried to join us yesterday. We had a little bit of a travel snafu with the storms in this part of the world, so apologies for missing and having to postpone, and many thanks for taking time out of your day today to come and join us. In any case, we'll send you a copy of the presentation afterwards, and those of you who are subscribers will get a full recording of the entire presentation. And also, this is going to be a pretty fast-paced 30 minutes here together. But if you have any questions at all, feel free to use the questions pane in the control panel to your right to ask any questions, and we'll have some time at the end to take them on. So, feel free to chime in with any questions or comments. So we talked about the right way to select technology. Let's just kick it off with a bang here, right, with the wrong way to selecting social and collaboration technology. So here's 4 things you should really probably not do. The first approach to selecting technology we often see is what we call love at first sight. And the idea here is that I saw something really cool, it has this great feature, we have to have this. And it's amazing how often we see this happen. The reality is that most of these tools are very similar in terms of features. It's not so much what they do that differs in, but how do they do it. The second approach we often see is this horse race sort of thing, which often people will look at analyst quadrants or ratings and say, well, this vendor is ahead, this vendor is behind, and so we want to go with the vendor who's ahead, who's leading the pack. The problem with this approach is that it's not really specific to your particular circumstances, you're not a generic company. You shouldn't necessarily go with the generic leader. And also, sometimes the fact that a company is really out there making a lot of sales can also actually make it problematic working with them. The third approach you see in the upper right is what we call the My Cousin Vinny approach, which is, hey, we know this firm that used Jive or SharePoint or what have you, and they were really successful with it. So if they're successful, then we can be too. So let's go with that. Now, of course, you do want to talk to your peers, but just because one company was successful, unless you're really identical to them, doesn't really guarantee that you'll be successful. The fourth approach that we see is probably the most alluring one, and we call this happiness is a stack of warm binders. That if you just do, gather enough detailed requirements and get all of your requirements down and cross-reference them against business objectives and spend a lot of time doing detailed analysis and coming up with spreadsheets, well, that's going to protect you from making the wrong decision. Reality is that in some ways this may be the worst approach to selecting software because it tends to obscure your priorities, and it gets you involved in sort of checklist questions with vendors about what they do, when in reality what matters the most here is how they do it. So the approach we're going to lay out today is really what we call an Agile approach. By Agile, I mean it's both empirical and iterative. It's a really test-based approach. And the nice thing about applying this approach in the social collaboration space is that many of these tools really lend themselves to some practical business and IT testing. All right, so now that I've told you the conclusion, let's talk about how we get there and why we're the people who have something to say about this. If you know Real Story Group, you know that we're a buyer's advocate. We really work for you, the customer. And for those of you who are looking at making an investment in either digital workplace or digital marketing technology, and what we do is provide in-depth research that analyzes the strengths but also the weaknesses of the technologies and the vendors. And so today we'll be focusing on collaboration and social software, what we call the red line on our subway map. But obviously, we cover a number of other adjacent technologies as well that sometimes overlap with collaboration and social software, but anyway, could be part and parcel of your digital workplace or digital marketing ecosystem. So we analyze the vendors and we advise subscribers on really making the right technology decisions on this journey so that they can be successful in doing what they need to do. And I'll be describing that methodology to you a little bit later today. One of the things we're known for is being very candid in our analysis of vendors, and one of the reasons why we're free to have this kind of independence is that we don't consult the vendors, we don't shill for them, we don't have them pay for travel and trips and wining and dining, and we don't write white papers or do webinars with them. We're completely independent, and that gives us the freedom to say really what is the customer experience as opposed to the vendor experience and the vendor marketing and architectures around this. And we do our research by talking to customers like you. It's a lot of very heavily qualitative, but we're also doing some quantitative research right now, including a survey that's underway on enterprise social and collaboration technology and usage. And if you would like to participate in that survey, and I definitely encourage you to do so, you can just follow this link here. You can write it down now, or when you get the PDF, just go ahead and click through, and we'll be happy to send it to you. And Elena, Mike is asking to put the link in the chat box, and we can certainly do that. That's a great idea, Mike. So we'll definitely go ahead and put the link in the chat box, and then you can copy paste it from there. So thanks, Mike, for that suggestion. Again, if any of you have any questions at all about what we're talking about today, or any comments or things you disagree with, feel free to use the questions tab on your right, and we'll go ahead and address those. And once again, for those of you who are joining us a little bit late here today, you will receive a copy of this presentation. If you're a Real Story Group subscriber, you'll get the entire recording. Okay, so let's get into it. Here's the agenda, pretty quick. I'm going to make a little bit of a distinction between collaboration and social computing, although they go naturally together, but they're seen a little bit differently in the marketplace. So I'm going to make a little bit of a distinction there. Then also make perhaps the most important distinction, which is when you're selecting, focusing on features versus applications. And I'm going to really make a strong case that you should focus on applications or use cases. Then we'll get into an overview of the marketplace, and then finally wrap up with the meat of the session here. What's the right way to select these tools? So let's get into it. Collaboration versus social networking. They're two different things. Although I'm going to argue here they're really joined at the hip. So collaboration is working jointly towards an activity. I like the definition that says working on an activity towards a common goal. It's something we all do in the workplace now. Social networking is a little bit different. It's about connecting with people often outside the context of a specific goal. But it's these sorts of human connections that are so critical, not just in our personal life, but also in our professional life, because work for human beings has always been social. It's just that our software hasn't always caught up with that. We are fundamentally social beings, and increasingly we need to have these sorts of relationships with our colleagues and partners and customers often across the globe. These are two different things, but they really work closely together. That is, that to collaborate effectively, it really helps to be able to have social networking capabilities, and social networking, we believe, is really critical to effective collaboration. The key thing here, though, is that traditionally in the marketplace, vendors have tended to focus on one or the other. In other words, even say Microsoft with SharePoint has traditionally been very collaboration-oriented and weak on networking, which is why they acquired Yammer. And even IBM has sort of different products for this. But in the real world, if you look at this from an employee perspective, really they don't tend to make, nor should they make, a distinction. In other words, they often want to be able, within the same broader workplace objectives, to do sort of traditional networking as well as collaboration. And so what this means is not just with Microsoft and IBM, but that often to have a really effective, what we would call social collaboration strategy, needs one technology. In fact, may require multiple technologies. And so in that context, this isn't really about necessarily picking the single best vendor, but having the collection of services together that you can integrate to provide an effective experience for your employees. So I'll talk about features and features versus applications. So this is kind of a traditional approach to looking at software. We see both business people and IT people sort of take this approach. And features are important. It's one of the things we evaluate across all of our streams, which is how does this particular tool perform with respect to various functional services? So you can break down collaboration and social computing into different functional services as well. And you can evaluate these different tools. We certainly do. This is our evaluation of SharePoint. What's interesting about SharePoint in this regard is it's probably the most feature complete of all the tools we evaluate, which is to say that there's no other tool that we evaluate that has this many, at least quarter of a pie wedge, a quarter of these Harvey balls or more across all of these different things. So SharePoint, what this says is that SharePoint is a very broad, full-featured platform. Now, how good is it at these various things? You can see that it's actually quite lagging with respect to discussion services, certainly blogging services and other sorts of things. But the capabilities are there at a very base level. Now, the thing about this is that if one of your colleagues walks into you and says, you know what, we need a wiki, what's the first thing that you're hopefully going to respond is you're going to say, well, what is that wiki for, right? Because you can use wikis to do a lot of different things which maybe they should or shouldn't do. And so the key thing here is these are a set of technology services. They're useful. They're building blocks. But if you start thinking about this from a business perspective, what is it that people are actually trying to do? That is for two reasons a much better way of looking at things. And the reason why it's a much better way of looking at things is that it allows you to address actual business value, and it also allows you to better evaluate technologies like SharePoint. So let's look at the 11 or 12 of them that we have in this particular marketplace. In this case, we call them application archetypes. You might think of them as business applications or use cases or scenarios. And this is what we call sort of the arc of participation here, that you have a set of applications, some of which are more collaboration-oriented and more formal and structured, others of which are more informal, unstructured, more networking-oriented. Now, you can go into our research and find out the differences among these different applications, but the case I'm going to make here is really twofold. One, that this is how you should be evaluating vendors, right? Rather than, do they have wiki services and how good is it? Well, that's important underneath the covers, but the real thing here is what is the vendor focusing on? What problems, what business problems are they trying to solve? And then secondly, this is how you really want to prioritize how you are going to address this problem. There are certain types of firms where knowledge-based management is very important. There are other types of firms where maybe enterprise discussion and innovation support could be more important, or there could be different groups within your organization. For example, customer service may be intensely interested in knowledge-based management, whereas more product managers and marketing people might be more interested in innovation support. So we really want to look at this from an application perspective, and here's just some examples. You've probably seen this before. It's an ideation and innovation platform. It's based on discussion services, so underneath this really is forum tools, but it's an actual finished application that you can install and use on day one. People generally can pick it up pretty quickly, and there's a lot of different subtle business rules in here which can be quite effective, and there's various types of these as well. Here's another example, which is around social Q&A. You've probably used this on the public internet in terms of asking questions and having people answer them, rating the answers, having the community rate the answers. We found this to be enormously effective within the enterprise, and under the right circumstances, can be extraordinarily valuable. Again, underneath this is forum software along with some other things, but it's actually baked into a particular application. And there's a lot of intelligence built into these applications as well, including avoiding duplicate questions, trying to surface the most commonly asked questions. This is really can be a very useful adjunct to any knowledge management strategy, or for that matter, any social networking strategy. But it's an actual application. And so just to circle back on SharePoint, this is really the issue with SharePoint, is that it's feature-rich, but out of the box, it's pretty application poor. Out of the box, it's pretty good at knowledge-based management. It's pretty good at project collaboration. Some of the other things really don't exist in any depth. And so what this means is that if you go with SharePoint, you often need to supplement it with a tool that works on top of it, or complement it with a tool that works next to it, or because it's a development platform, you can apply time, money, and painkillers into morphing SharePoint into whatever it is that you want to make out of it. And people have obviously done that. And you know that if every $9 that are spent on SharePoint, or every $10 are spent on SharePoint, often it's $7 to $8 that are spent on collaboration and are spent on customization. So SharePoint is very much a customizable platform, which is the beauty of the platform, but also the drawback. The point here, though, is not so much to dig at Microsoft, because you have a similar issue with IBM and Oracle, who have developed these platforms that emphasize one or two things, but don't necessarily have the full suite of capabilities here. But the reality is that there's no single tool that is going to do very, very well across all of these. So you want to prioritize from an enterprise perspective, which are the sorts of applications that you really want to drive here, and align your technology investments around that, and then see where you can make up on some of the other applications that are more of a second or third priority. And what that means is that you may be in a multi-application environment, and even with SharePoint, Microsoft is saying that, well, if you want certain, say, a community of practice or social discussion, enterprise-wide discussion, then turn to Yammer, right, which is a completely separate product, completely separate repository, not particularly well integrated with SharePoint today. They have separate activity streams, separate profile systems. Microsoft has put out some nice pictures about what it'll look like in the future. It's all going to be pretty much tied into Office 365. So if you're on-premise, it's going to be a very different story. The point here, again, is not so much to dig at Microsoft, because IBM has issues where they're trying to address this with 2 or 3 different products as well, but just to point out that your future here may be a multi-product sort of landscape, and there's going to be some integration work to do. So that's a good opportunity to segue then into the marketplace at large for collaboration and social technology. And let's look at, what does this look like? So, we're an analyst firm. We like to create buckets for things. And this is how it's a 2-dimensional view of how we break out the market. In reality, you would have a 3-dimensional view that looked at cost, certainly the technology platform. There are regional differences here. Some of these firms have more or better footprint in, say, Europe and Asia Pac than North America, and vice versa. But this is a way of sort of organizing it at some level in terms of the complexity. So you have platform vendors in the upper left. Then you have major suites and smaller suites, traditionally a pretty happy place in the marketplace, maybe not always the largest firms, although Google obviously very large, but have been relatively successful in terms of bringing social collaboration capabilities to market and innovating very quickly. Specialist players, typically around wiki and blog services. And there's a new one that I'll talk about, or I'll say an emerging segment that I'll talk about a little bit later here, is around this whole notion of social enterprise layers, to layer on top of your existing platforms. So you have a variety of choices, a lot of cool tools and companies with interesting names and a lot of street cred. I think the thing to remember is that although there's a lot of good thing about these tools, also since software development is really about making trade-offs, there's going to be disadvantages to all of these platforms as well. And so what we try to do is give you sort of a balanced story to say, okay, say Tibber on the lower left from Tibco Software, a very interesting product. The social layer vendor has its benefits, and also, has its drawbacks inevitably. And so you want to take a kind of a balanced approach here and really make sure that going in, not just the pros, but also the cons of the different tools. And one of the areas in this segment in particular that we see is a lot of emphasis on feature richness, but still, even 7 or 8 years in here, a fair bit of immaturity when it comes to certain enterprise-wide administrative and system services that you might require. This isn't always the sexiest part, but it does, in this particular segment, lead to a lot of what we call sort of enterprise surprise, where you implement a particular technology in a pilot level and it works okay, and then you try to scale it across the enterprise, and because it doesn't have particularly good entitlements model, or it doesn't work well with internationalization, or there isn't particularly good configuration management, that you really struggle to do it effectively at scale. And this is all the more reason why it's so critical to be able to test these tools and simulate what your experience is going to be like against specific use cases before you just dive in and make a choice. Really quickly on social collaboration as a layer, this is an emerging trend. I cite it as an emerging trend and not necessarily something you can purchase easily today, but you know, the traditional notion of collaboration, social computing, is that it is another piece of your business set of business applications that might live within and underneath an enterprise stack. If you're doing that successfully already, you're even a little bit ahead of the game. But I think people who have been doing this for a while recognize that maybe we should think about social and collaboration services less as a space to go to and more as a layer or something that I can do across my enterprise. And there's a lot of potential here. The problem is that from a standards and an architectural perspective, and even with respect to security and compliance, as an industry, we're not really quite there yet. We're seeing some vendors sort of work slowly towards that, certainly SocialCast in a lightweight way, Tibber in a more heavyweight way, NewsGator, now Cision on top of SharePoint and potentially SAP, and then you have Chatter, which is a layer on top of Salesforce. So we're seeing some, you know, approaches here, but they tend to be somewhat narrow in scope. But this is definitely something, particularly architecturally, to keep an eye on as a trend. Here's a screenshot from Chatter. Chatter works really well when you are already within Salesforce because it's in the flow of your work. So if you're using Salesforce all day, Chatter's great because it's right there. From an enterprise architecture perspective, Chatter has a lot of issues. It stores documents in different places. The security model's a little bit off, and it doesn't really work outside of Salesforce. So it's not really an enterprise platform. But I think what it teaches us is really the importance of putting social into the flow of people's everyday work and thinking about it a little bit more broadly than just sort of a place to go and let my hair down. Okay, so how to select? You know, ultimately you want to get to some sort of a short list. We sell research for a living, so obviously I'm going to argue that that's a great way to help get from a long list to a short list and even to a shorter list based on what others before have learned. And you know, you can do RFPs if you're already down to 3 or 4. You can do vendor demos, and ultimately we really encourage doing an actual bake-off or sandbox process between two particular vendors. The point here is that this is an iterative process of winnowing down, and it's test-based. And by test-based, I mean that even in a kind of a written RFP or any kind of a demo or any kind of a test bed, as we move down the triangle here, that you're not demoing sort of the vendor's use cases, you're demoing your use cases. In other words, you've isolated which of those 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 applications that are really important for you. How do you want them to work? Who would be the people who would participate? And have the vendor test your use cases, not its use case. And then you can actually simulate what it's going to be like to work with this tool before you. So you want to hold a real bake-off, find out which type of pie works best for you, and you'll learn a lot about your own tastes there as well. So this isn't just about testing the vendors; it's also sort of sense checking your requirements, which we find for social and collaboration is very often that people go into it sort of expecting that they want one thing and then coming out and realizing maybe they need something else. Again, you don't want to take a horse race approach that here, the idea here is that this is really all about what's the right fit for you. There's going to be a kind of a functional fit, technology, partner fit, and of course value, cost, total cost of ownership, return on your investment, critical. You won't always find that the single best vendor is going to be the best fit across all 4 of these, so often this is an exercise in trade-offs. I think maybe that's one of our #1 advisory calls that we have with our subscribers, is helping them work through trade-offs and understanding what's the best fit when the story isn't always crystal clear. And you want to try to balance these 4, obviously. So some people say, well, I don't really have time for a test-based process, and I would argue actually it saves you time in the longer run, because you know, in a traditional process along the top, you spend all this time with requirements. You might do an RFP, proposals, demos, but then If you make a decision right after a bunch of demos, often it takes you a while to actually you've got to get the project initiated, develop specifications, then you're getting to an implementation. Whereas a more iterative process says, okay, we're going to spend some time on requirements, but we're going to focus on building use cases and test cases. We're still going to maybe go through an RFP, proposals, demo. Then we're going to have a bake-off or a POC before we select the tool here. And what we find is that when you do that, you can get to a live pilot much faster. So you take a little bit longer maybe making the decision on the vendor, but you become a lot smarter and you're able to get to value much faster after that process. So you get more value, more lessons delivered earlier through this sort of more agile, iterative approach. So that was a very quick tour. Invite you to post any kind of questions here, or certainly by the file. You'll all receive a follow-up email. You're welcome to reply to that as well. This is my contact information. If you haven't already, I encourage you to go to our website and download a free sample chapter of our research. Also to participate in our survey. And again, if I was going to leave you with one key thing here, the takeaway is don't focus on feature functionality. It is important, but what's more important is the actual prioritizing the applications that you want to, the business applications that you want to do to drive value, and to use those as test cases in your selection process.